The history of the Second World War is often told through the movements of massive armies and the decisions of powerful leaders, leaving little room for the stories of smaller communities whose contributions were vital but less visible. Among these are the Apache people, whose participation in World War II has long remained on the margins of popular memory. Their involvement did not fit neatly into prevailing narratives of the war or into the simplified portrayals of Native Americans that dominated much of 20th century historical writing. As a result, their experiences were frequently minimized or overlooked altogether. When the United States entered World War II, Apache men and women, like many Native Americans, faced a complex decision. They came from communities that had endured decades of broken treaties, forced relocations, and cultural suppression by the same federal government now calling for their service. Despite this history, thousands of Native Americans enlisted, including Apaches from reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Some were motivated by economic necessity, others by a desire to protect their homelands, and many by a warrior tradition that emphasized duty, endurance, and courage. Apache soldiers served across multiple branches of the U.S. military. They fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, often in frontline roles. While the Navajo Code Talkers are the most widely recognized Native American contributors to wartime communications, Apache servicemen also used their language in secure transmissions, particularly in the Pacific Theater. Apache languages, with their complexity and limited number of fluent speakers outside their communities, proved extremely difficult for enemy forces to decipher. These contributions remained classified for years, delaying recognition and reinforcing their absence from mainstream histories. Beyond communications, Apache soldiers were valued for skills shaped by their cultural background and environment. Many grew up hunting, tracking, and navigating rugged terrain, abilities that translated effectively into reconnaissance and scouting roles. In jungle and mountain warfare, these skills could mean the difference between life and death. Fellow soldiers sometimes remarked on their endurance, situational awareness, and calm under pressure, qualities that were respected even if they were rarely celebrated publicly after the war. Apache women also played an important role during World War II, though their contributions have been even less acknowledged. Some served in uniform as nurses, clerks, and support personnel, while others worked in defense industries or maintained their communities at home as men left to fight overseas. Reservation economies were deeply affected by wartime labor demands, and Apache women often carried the burden of sustaining families while navigating rationing. Poverty and limited access to resources. The return home was not always triumphant. Like many veterans, Apache servicemen faced physical and psychological wounds, but they also encountered persistent discrimination. Benefits provided through the GI Bill were unevenly distributed, particularly on reservations where access to loans, education, and healthcare was limited. For some Apache veterans, military service did not translate into the social or economic mobility they had been promised. Instead, it highlighted the contradiction of having fought for freedoms abroad that were still constrained at home. For decades after the war, the stories of Apache participation remained largely absent from textbooks, documentaries, and public commemorations. This silence was partly the result of broader neglect of Native American history and partly due to the classification of certain wartime roles. It was also influenced by lingering stereotypes that framed Apaches either as figures of the distant past or as obstacles to American expansion, rather than as modern individuals actively shaping 20th century history. In recent years, efforts by historians, tribal communities, and descendants of veterans have begun to change this narrative. Oral histories, archival research, and public recognition ceremonies have helped bring these experiences into clearer focus. These accounts reveal not a hidden tale of savagery or excess, but one of resilience, service, and complexity. Apache involvement in World War II challenges simplistic views of both the war and Native American history, reminding us that the conflict was fought by people from diverse backgrounds whose stories deserve equal attention. Uncovering this overlooked history does more than fill a gap in the record. It forces a reconsideration of how national memory is constructed and whose contributions are deemed worthy of remembrance. The Apache experience in World War II stands as a testament to loyalty amid injustice and to the enduring presence of indigenous peoples in shaping modern history. Even when that presence has been deliberately ignored, Apache soldiers and women played vital, but long overlooked, roles across multiple theaters of World War II. Yet their participation was rarely acknowledged in real time and only partially understood decades later. When the United States mobilized for war after 1941, Native American communities responded in large numbers, and Apache communities were no exception. Despite a long history of conflict with the U.S. government, including forced removals, military campaigns, and systemic marginalization, Apache men volunteered or were drafted into service at rates that matched or exceeded the national average. Their decision to serve was shaped by a complex mix of motivations that included economic survival during the Depression era, cultural values tied to warrior traditions, and a sense of responsibility to protect their lands and families from global threats. Apache servicemen entered nearly every branch of the U.S. military, including the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, and Army Air Forces. They were deployed to Europe, North Africa, and especially the Pacific, where terrain and combat conditions often mirrored the harsh environments many had grown up navigating. Unlike the stereotypical portrayals that confine Native Americans to ceremonial or symbolic roles, Apache soldiers were placed directly into combat units as infantrymen, scouts, medics, engineers, and artillery crew members. Their presence was not exceptional within their units, yet it was exceptional in how completely it vanished from later public memory. One of the most significant but least publicized contributions involved the use of Apache languages in military communications. While the Navajo code talkers eventually became widely recognized, several other native languages were also used for secure transmissions, including Apache dialects. Apache speakers transmitted tactical messages over radios and field phones, relying on the complexity of their language structures and the near-total absence of non-native speakers among enemy forces. These communications roles were often informal and classified, which meant that many Apache veterans could not discuss their work for years, even with their families, effectively erasing their contributions from the historical record during the immediate post-war period. Beyond communications, Apache soldiers were frequently assigned duties that demanded heightened awareness, endurance, and adaptability. Many grew up in rural or reservation settings where hunting, tracking, and long-distance travel were part of daily life. These experiences translated naturally into reconnaissance patrols, night movements, and survival situations behind or near enemy lines. Commanders sometimes relied on Apache soldiers for point positions during patrols or for navigating unfamiliar terrain. Though these decisions were rarely documented in ways that highlighted cultural background as an asset rather than a coincidence, Apache women also made essential contributions to the war effort, both in uniform and on the home front. Some enlisted in the Women's Army Corps or served as nurses and administrative personnel, performing duties that freed male soldiers for combat roles. Others left reservations to work in factories, shipyards, and military installations, producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies critical to wartime logistics. For many Apache women, this was their first sustained experience working outside their communities, exposing them to both new opportunities and widespread discrimination. They often faced language barriers, cultural isolation, and racial prejudice while simultaneously supporting extended families back home. Life on Apache reservations during the war was marked by profound change. As men left for military service and women entered wartime labor, traditional social structures were disrupted. Elders and children were often left behind with limited resources, and federal support remained inconsistent. Rationing, poor infrastructure, and inadequate health care intensified existing hardships. Despite these conditions, families maintained communication with loved ones overseas, sending letters, prayers, and ceremonial items meant to offer protection. These spiritual and cultural practices formed an invisible but meaningful extension of Apache participation. In the war effort, the risks Apache servicemen faced were no different from those encountered by other soldiers. They endured intense combat, harsh climates, disease, and the psychological strain of prolonged warfare. Casualties among Apache units were real and significant, yet their losses were rarely singled out or commemorated separately. When Apache soldiers were wounded or killed, their stories were absorbed into broader military statistics, leaving families with little public recognition of their sacrifice. In some cases, language barriers and bureaucratic indifference complicated notification processes, delaying or obscuring information about the fate of loved ones. Recognition during the war was minimal, and praise, when given, was usually framed in generalized terms that avoided acknowledging Native identity. This invisibility was not accidental, but reflected broader attitudes that viewed Native Americans as relics of the past rather than contemporary participants in modern warfare. Military publications, newsreels, and propaganda materials focused overwhelmingly on white, and to a lesser extent, African American soldiers, leaving Native contributions unmentioned. This omission reinforced stereotypes and ensured that Apache involvement would not become part of the dominant narrative of World War II, even within their own communities. Many Apache veterans spoke little about their service after returning home. Some were bound by secrecy, others by trauma, and many by the understanding that their experiences were unlikely to be valued by the broader society. As years passed, memories faded, and stories were lost with the deaths of elders who had served. It was only through later oral history projects and tribal initiatives that fragments of these experiences began to resurface, revealing how deeply Apache participation had been woven into the fabric of the global conflict while remaining almost entirely absent from its popular retelling. Their linguistic, scouting, and survival skills made significant military contributions that remained underrecognized for decades, not because they were minor or peripheral, but because they operated quietly within systems that rarely documented or credited indigenous expertise. Many Apache recruits entered the military with abilities shaped by generations of adaptation to demanding environments. Long before enlistment, they learned how to read land, weather, and subtle signs of movement, skills that were not formally taught in military training manuals, but proved invaluable in combat situations. These capabilities often set Apache soldiers apart, even if their superiors did not fully understand the cultural foundations behind them. Language was among the most strategically important tools Apache servicemen brought with them. Apache languages are complex, tonal, and highly contextual, with meanings that shift depending on phrasing and situation. During the war, this complexity became an asset. In multiple units, Apache speakers were used to transmit sensitive information verbally when speed and security were critical. Messages relayed in Apache could not be deciphered by enemy forces, who lacked both linguistic familiarity and cultural reference points. Unlike standardized codes, these communications required no written key, making interception useless. Because these practices were often improvised at the unit level and later classified, they left little paper trail, contributing to their disappearance from official histories. The use of Apache languages was especially effective in fast-moving combat environments such as jungle warfare in the Pacific. Radio transmissions in English could be intercepted and decoded, but spoken Apache offered immediate encryption. Soldiers could communicate coordinates, troop movements, and warnings with confidence that the information would remain secure. In some cases, Apache speakers worked in pairs, one transmitting and one receiving, ensuring accuracy under pressure. These roles demanded not only linguistic fluency, but composure, memory, and trust, as even minor errors could lead to disastrous consequences. Scouting and reconnaissance further highlighted Apache expertise. Many Apache soldiers were accustomed to traveling long distances on foot, conserving energy, and remaining alert over extended periods. These abilities translated naturally into patrol duties, where endurance and awareness were essential. Apache scouts could move quietly through unfamiliar terrain, recognize signs of recent activity, and anticipate ambushes based on environmental cues. In dense jungles, mountains, or arid landscapes, such skills were often more reliable than maps or aerial reconnaissance. Especially when conditions changed rapidly, tracking was another skill that proved invaluable. The ability to distinguish fresh footprints from older ones, to read broken foliage or disturbed soil, and to infer numbers and direction of movement gave Apache soldiers a tactical advantage. These skills were frequently used to locate enemy positions, avoid traps, or confirm whether an area was secure. While non-native soldiers could be trained in basic tracking, the depth of experience Apache scouts brought was the result of lifelong practice rather than short-term instruction. Yet these contributions were rarely recorded as specialized expertise, instead being absorbed into vague commendations for unit effectiveness. Survival skills also played a crucial role, particularly in situations where supply lines were disrupted or units became isolated. Apache soldiers often knew how to locate water, identify edible plants, and construct shelter from minimal materials. In extreme conditions, these skills could sustain entire groups, not just individuals. Stories from veterans describe situations in which Apache servicemen guided their units through unfamiliar territory, preventing dehydration, exposure, or starvation. Such acts were rarely formalized into awards or citations. Despite their direct impact on mission success and troop survival, the military structure of the time did not encourage recognition of culturally derived skills. Training emphasized uniformity and discipline, and abilities that fell outside standardized doctrine are often taken for granted. Apache soldiers were expected to perform these tasks without acknowledgement, and their skills were sometimes attributed to personal aptitude rather than cultural knowledge. This framing allowed the military to benefit from indigenous expertise without challenging prevailing assumptions about Native Americans or reconsidering their place in modern society. Racial attitudes further contributed to the lack of recognition. Native American soldiers occupied an ambiguous position within the military hierarchy, often grouped with other minorities and subject to discrimination. Their skills were valued pragmatically, but not celebrated publicly. Official reports and after-action summaries focused on outcomes rather than individual contributions, and when individuals were mentioned, their native identity was usually omitted. This erasure ensured that even exemplary service did not translate into broader awareness of Apache involvement. After the war, classification policies compounded the problem. Linguistic work, particularly involving secure communications, remained secret for years. Veterans were instructed not to discuss their roles, preventing them from sharing their experiences, even within their own communities. As time passed, memories faded, and many veterans died before their stories could be recorded. When recognition eventually came for native code talkers, it focused primarily on the Navajo, leaving Apache contributions largely unmentioned and misunderstood. Within Apache communities, these skills were understood differently. They were not viewed as extraordinary talents, but as extensions of cultural knowledge passed down through generations. Hunting, tracking, and land navigation were taught as responsibilities tied to survival and respect for the environment. Language was not merely a communication tool, but a carrier of worldview, relationships, and values. Seeing these elements used in war created a complicated legacy, blending pride in service with discomfort over how cultural knowledge was deployed, and then forgotten. The long delay in acknowledgement has had lasting effects on historical memory. Without official documentation or widespread public recognition, Apache contributions remained largely confined to oral histories and family stories. Historians working decades later faced challenges, reconstructing these roles due to sparse records and the reluctance of some veterans to revisit traumatic experiences. Even when evidence emerged, it struggled to compete with established narratives that prioritized technological innovation and high-level strategy over human skill and adaptation. As more testimonies have surfaced, a clearer picture has emerged of how deeply Apache linguistic, scouting, and survival abilities shaped local outcomes during the war. These skills did not operate in isolation, but were integrated into daily military operations, influencing decisions, reducing casualties, and increasing operational effectiveness. They demonstrate that modern warfare was not fought solely with machines and codes, but also with knowledge rooted in place, memory, and lived experience that predated the conflict by centuries and continued to function. Even as the world around it was transformed by global war post-war, discrimination and historical neglect obscured Apache veterans' sacrifices and achievements in ways that extended far beyond simple oversight, shaping lives, families, and collective memory for generations. When Apache servicemen returned home after World War II, they did so with the same expectations held by millions of other veterans, that their service would be acknowledged and that the promises made by the government would be honored. Instead, many encountered the same structural barriers and racial prejudices that had existed before the war, now sharpened by the contrast between their wartime contributions and their peacetime treatment. The GI Bill, often celebrated as a transformative policy for American veterans, was unevenly applied in practice. While it offered education benefits, housing loans, and financial assistance, access depended heavily on local institutions that frequently discriminated against Native Americans. For Apache veterans living on or near reservations, banks were reluctant to issue loans. Colleges were geographically distant or culturally hostile, and administrative systems were ill-equipped or unwilling to accommodate reservation residents. As a result, benefits that helped lift many white veterans into the middle class remained largely out of reach for Apache servicemen, reinforcing cycles of poverty rather than alleviating them. Healthcare presented another major challenge. Many Apache veterans returned with physical injuries or psychological trauma, but medical facilities were scarce on reservations, and Veterans Administration hospitals were often located far away. Transportation barriers, bureaucratic complexity, and language differences made accessing care difficult. Mental health support was particularly limited, and the concept of combat-related psychological trauma was poorly understood at the time. Apache veterans were expected to reintegrate quietly into their communities, often carrying unresolved trauma without institutional support or public acknowledgement. Social discrimination compounded these difficulties. Despite having worn the same uniform as other American soldiers, Apache veterans were frequently denied equal treatment in towns bordering reservations. They faced segregation in public spaces, employment discrimination, and racial stereotyping that dismissed their service as irrelevant or exaggerated. In some cases, veterans who had served overseas were barred from establishments that served white customers or treated as second-class citizens in the very communities they had defended. This contradiction underscored the gap between the ideals they fought for and the reality they returned to historical neglect further deepened this marginalization. Official war histories, school textbooks, and public commemorations largely excluded Apache contributions. Victory narratives emphasized industrial output, military leadership, and technological innovation, leaving little room for indigenous participation. When Native Americans were mentioned at all, they were often grouped into vague categories or reduced to symbolic footnotes. Apache veterans saw their experiences erased, not only from national memory, but also from local histories that might have validated their sacrifices. The classification of wartime activities played a role in this erasure. Many Apache veterans who worked in communications or intelligence-related roles were sworn to secrecy and could not discuss their service for decades. This silence was often misinterpreted as a lack of contribution rather than a requirement imposed by the military. By the time restrictions were lifted, many veterans had passed away and their first-hand accounts were lost. Families who might have preserved these stories were left with fragments, unable to fully articulate the significance of what their relatives had done. Within Apache communities, the return of veterans brought both pride and tension. Military service introduced new perspectives and experiences that did not always align easily with traditional life. Veterans who had traveled widely and encountered different cultures sometimes struggled to reconcile those experiences with reservation realities. At the same time, their service did not shield them from federal policies that continued to undermine tribal sovereignty and economic stability. The absence of recognition reinforced a sense that participation in national defense did not translate into respect or inclusion. Public recognition, when it eventually arrived, was slow and incomplete. Decades passed before broader attention turned toward Native American veterans, and even then, recognition often focused on a narrow set of narratives. Apache veterans were frequently overshadowed by more widely publicized groups, leaving their specific experiences underrepresented. Medals, honors, and ceremonies came late, if at all, and rarely addressed the systemic injustices veterans faced after returning home. Symbolic acknowledgement could not undo years of neglect or materially improve lives that had already been shaped by missed opportunities. The impact of this neglect extended to families and future generations. Children and grandchildren grew up with limited awareness of their relatives' wartime service, in part because the broader society showed little interest in preserving those stories. Without inclusion in textbooks or museums, Apache participation in World War II remained largely invisible, affecting how younger generations understood their place in national history. This absence reinforced harmful narratives that framed indigenous peoples as peripheral to modern events rather than active participants in shaping them. Efforts to correct this historical neglect have faced significant obstacles. Researchers attempting to document Apache veterans' experiences often encountered sparse records, inconsistent documentation, and institutional indifference. Oral histories became essential, but they required trust and time to develop, especially among veterans who had spent decades feeling ignored or marginalized. Community-led initiatives worked to preserve these stories, but without sustained public support, their reach remained limited. The emotional toll of this neglect cannot be separated from its material consequences. For many Apache veterans, the lack of acknowledgement communicated that their sacrifices were disposable, their service conditional, and their identity incompatible with national belonging. This message lingered long after the war, shaping attitudes toward military service, government institutions, and historical narratives within Apache communities. The silence surrounding their contributions became another form of injustice layered onto existing ones, reinforcing the distance between lived experience and public memory. As recognition efforts increased in later years, they revealed not only what had been forgotten, but how deliberate that forgetting had been. The absence of Apache veterans from mainstream World War II history was not the result of a lack of evidence, but of selective storytelling that prioritized certain voices while excluding others. Restoring these stories has required confronting uncomfortable truths about race, citizenship, and whose sacrifices are deemed worthy of remembrance. Truths that continue to influence how history is written and whose service is valued.